Hey everyone, this is Andy Sajous here at Ahead. I am one of our field CTOs who works primarily in healthcare, and I'm joined today with Matt. Matt, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
You bet. Hi, Matt Beaverson. I'm a new field CTO at Ahead covering healthcare. Have over 20 years experience in the healthcare IT space. I've been involved in consulting, a lot of work in Epic, including leading multiple Epic implementations. Last few years, I've been working with solution integrators to grow healthcare practices, and now I'm at Ahead, and very happy to be here.
That's great, Matt, and welcome aboard. I think the team's happy to have you. As we kind of work hand in hand with a lot of our healthcare clients, I think you'll be a great contributor to that. And so that being said, it's a great pivot into kind of just ahead in our healthcare business. And so as many, I meet many organizations on a day-to-day basis. I kind of tend to repeat this is 35% of Ahead's revenue is in the healthcare provider space. It's the largest vertical we work with. Um, I think I have the pleasure, now you have the pleasure of working with many of our clients across the country now, engaged in many strategic developments, whether it's around platform modernization, AI transformation, and more importantly, on the day-to-day basis, kind of what the challenges that they're kind of going through. Matt, I think, the reason for this video is we want to talk a lot about our healthcare summit. So
Yes.
Ahead, we just hosted our third annual healthcare summit. We had the pleasure to do this at the Cleveland Clinic. So the Cleveland Clinic was gracious enough to give us access into their facilities, as well as some exclusive tours of their research organization, and we'll get into that. But I think, before we kind of go by session, Matt, you want to kind of give us your take, your experience at the healthcare summit?
Yes, it was a very productive summit, a lot of interaction from our customers, very collaborative. And the neat thing about it was it wasn't about what Ahead's selling. It wasn't about products or vendors. It was about the healthcare organizations and how their leadership is working to improve patient care, reduce administrative costs, and move healthcare forward based on their work and able to learn from each other and challenge each other at times too.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's a great point. I think that the reason why I'm always drawn to healthcare is how collaborative it is, in how we can get leaders into a singular room and they'll share a lot of ideas, right? I think Sarah Hatchett, the CIO of Cleveland Clinic, said it best: is like, how do we make sure we're still mission driven, right? And make sure we are the caregivers, regardless of where we sit within the organization. And so, to me, that speaks volumes to the people we had in the room, and to kind of set the table for everyone so they understand. We had close to 24, 25 CIOs and CTOs of various health systems. And we'll kind of get into that in a little bit. And so, if you kind of look at the agenda and look kind of how it was structured for the various sessions, as you mentioned, a lot of clients speaking to clients, right? Like not a lot of vendors. We didn't have a lot of individuals from Ahead speaking. It's really try to drive that collaboration, that discussion, and more importantly, expose people to what the other health systems are doing, to drive innovation and some of the, to your point, the goals that they're trying to drive towards. So if we look at the first session, and that was led by Sarah Hatchett, right? So she was the CIO of Cleveland Clinic. I think she's very impressive in the way she kind of articulates the Cleveland Clinic strategy, more specifically around their AI and research-driven initiatives. Matt, from what Sarah articulated to the group and us as well, like what was your big takeaways from her session?
I think we definitely learned from Sarah that clinical AI is real in practical ways, and the clinic is working with it. I say that because a lot of the early AI value proofs were centered on revenue cycle and
Mhm.
administration. And there's been, some doubt whether clinical AI would keep up in a way that would be useful and drive value for healthcare organizations. It's becoming apparent that it is. I say that not as a full-throated endorsement because there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to have clinical AI be as valuable as we would like it to be. And we need to keep an eye on that for patient safety reasons, as well as for financial reasons to not spend in areas that aren't driving value. But I think Sarah made that very clear. Um, It was also interesting. I talked with her a bit after her session, and she and I both are seeing how ambient documentation vendors are now driving into other areas such as um, proper coding, um, prior authorization, denials,
Hmm.
etc. And so I think we're starting to get past the point of um, AI as a siloed pilot and starting to see platforms developing, both from the vendor perspective, and I think we'll start to see that as some of the systems decide to develop their own, which really drives us to think about AI from a multimodal
Yeah.
perspective.
Yeah, yeah. I think there was a couple discussions that came up even in the earlier sessions as well around just the pilot purgatory discussions around it's not just the success of a pilot, it's how do we actually make it transformational and I would say reduce the burden of the physicians or in many cases actually affect patient care. I think to your point, ambient listening, without a doubt, like across the board, I hear this day in day out, even before our summit, around organizations that articulate that like it's table stakes now. The reduction of cognitive load we're seeing on patients, and the ease of use around a solution like ambient listening, and more importantly, the reduction of pajama time, right? So physicians not spending 3 4 hours at the end of their shift documenting and actually looking at patients in the eye and doing going back to what they got into that business or that practice for, is worth mentioning, and I think that's some of the successes. The other thing I'll throw out there around Sarah's session was just around the idea of driving innovation and not necessarily leveraging governance too much as a roadblock. Like it's
Mhm.
important to have governance as a health system, but at the same time, how do we enable research and not be in the way of research? And I think
Correct.
what Sarah articulated to Cleveland Clinic strategy, which is publicly out there, they're very deliberate around driving innovation and allowing groups to do innovative things with a light touch of governance, right? Like as kind of Sarah had alluded to.
Yeah, it's interesting, and if you don't mind, maybe we take a brief segue there because you touched on
Hmm.
um, not becoming a blocker for research, et cetera. Did you get the feeling like I did that we're on the cusp of a bit of a new era in healthcare IT, that the speed of which technology is being adopted is going to necessitate new leadership and new ways of thinking?
Absolutely, 100%. I think there's a couple things that I think are happening right now in the moment. The speed of technology and AI development, we see it today, right? So every 3 4 months, we have new models coming out, new capabilities with those models, and you hear it whether it's SDLC and some of the software development life cycles, the impact that Mythos is having, a lot of what we're seeing with Claude Code and the ability to vibe code applications pretty quickly, like a lot of that's changing. I think that the way I think traditional IT leaders have thought about things, and to your point, like there is a pace that we now need to keep up with it, but also I think it's also creating opportunity. It's creating opportunity for IT leaders to be a seat at the table, and we heard some pieces of that, and it's actually a really good transition into our next session. And so we talked about the partner.
You're gonna bring up Rob before I do.
No, 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 no. I was
Oh,
gonna.
okay. Well, we had there's a transition to another one of our sessions then
Yeah,
too.
yeah, yeah. So no, the first session, the next session I was going to transition to was the more around how do we partner with our clinical peers, right? And so we had Deb Anderson from
Yep.
Endeavor Health, who was joined by their lead pathologist, Dr. Groth. And if you kind of look at what they've done at Endeavor, they've done some groundbreaking things with digital pathology, and so I always struggle to attempt to articulate how groundbreaking this is, but John Groth has been on a circuit in his circles, specifically pertaining to pathology circles, around running a full digital lab at Endeavor Health, leveraging platforms like Google, and more importantly, building machine learning and AI capabilities into what they're doing, just simple as cancer screening. And I think what's novel about that discussion and that panel is how IT and its clinical peer partnered together, right? Meaning there's what IT had to bring to the table. There's things that I think John and his team needed, and how do they actually do something innovative and groundbreaking at the pace that it needs to happen? Matt, let me kind of pause there. Like, what was your thoughts on that session?
The the work they've done is really impressive. John impressed me significantly because of the fact not only is he a clinician and therefore clinically focused, he's brought that into his technical work, but at the same time has been technically focused. Um, he talked about how they were able to reduce um, the number of images that they needed for diagnosis, et cetera, and talked about how they were able to build efficiencies so they weren't simply eating through storage and using compute unnecessarily. And so to be able to blend that leading with the clinical, but also having enough technical savvy
Yes.
to optimize the technical environment, that was simply extraordinarily impressive.
Yeah, I think I have to go back and what one of my peers said. What Endeavor Health is, what they're doing is they have something special, right? So they have the executive leadership like Deb, who's willing to bring the right resources to the table, while also going through significant integration work, right? And that's challenging in itself, and
Yep.
it's impressive to see that come to fruition along with what John was able to do and accomplish. And if you talk to John, and to your point, he's very passionate. I think he's very charismatic in the way he kind of discusses these types of topics, and I think it's because of his passion that they're wildly successful, and you can see it. And to your point, every time we're blessed to see physicians who are also have technical acumen, and we've seen that in previous healthcare summits as well. It's fascinating to see why. Or no, actually, I take that back. It hits you right in the face of why they're successful is because they can straddle both, and that's kind of my standpoint.
Yeah,
Uh,
Deb to me, stands out as one of those leaders that we've been asking for decades. I've been at this for a while, and we've
mhm,
we've that entire time talked about things like business IT alignment and the need for CIOs to be more than technical, et cetera. Um, and I think we're finally seeing the fruit of that with leaders like Deb,
mhm.
leaders like Rob that we'll discuss here in a minute. And we're going to need that more than ever due to the acceleration that we talked about earlier, as far as the technology driving change faster than perhaps we're ready to absorb it.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a great transition into our next session, right? So, if you look at Rob Adamson from RWJ Barnabas, the RWJ Barnabas is a significantly large health system in the state of New Jersey. They're aligned to Rutgers University, and if you kind of see what Rob is doing, I mean, a lot of what he talked about was advocacy and early awareness, right? So, how do we get IT at the table to be a partner of all the different groups within the organization? And some of those are clinically driven, some of those are not. I think what was fascinating to me was his involvement on some of these councils that weren't even clinically driven, but had a
Mhm.
necessity for IT to be at the table.
Yeah.
And I think what we've always, I think Matt, what we've always talked about is like, does IT become like a loud voice at a table? And I think Rob's successfully done that. I want to throw it to you. Kind of, what was your thoughts around Rob's session in advocacy and early awareness?
He and I talked after his presentation, and I asked him directly, how did you pull off transforming an IT organization that large in such a short period of time? Because he made tremendous progress with the organization and the IT team within 2 years. And he shared how that was because he had been a clinician in the system for a number of years, had the relationships, et cetera. And I think, there's some lessons learned there when we look at what type of CIO leadership is going to be successful moving forward. It, Rob's proven it can be a clinician who is admittedly very humble, about their limited technical knowledge, is willing to lean on others, but is focused on the types of outcomes that healthcare demands today, whether it be clinical, administrative, financial, et cetera, and do that in a way that has a very meaningful impact across all those dimensions. Um, and I realize I've mentioned this a couple times also, but I'm fully convinced we're on the cusp of substantial change, um, both moving forward as far as innovation, but also having to tighten up how we run IT because
Hmm.
of things like Anthropic's Mythos model and the impact that's going to have as there's more exposure to that, et cetera. And healthcare IT needs to get ready for another time of extreme um, opportunity, but it's going to take a lot of dedication. It reminds me a bit of what we saw in the early mid 2000s with EHR adoption.
Hmm.
Been able to take a bit of a breath from that, but I think those days of being a bit slower are going to be gone for a while.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think to your point, there's this trend we see around organizations that adopt more of a clinical focused CIO, right? And sometimes they are physicians themselves, or have some clinical background, and I think the reality is, I think as we enable technology, we want it to work for the clinicians, right? And that's kind of the sentiment we hear, right? Is making sure that the technology we roll out is going to be productive not only for the patient but the physician. And end of the day, I think that's a lot of the lessons learned we've heard through the EHR rollouts, as they were 10, 15 years ago. Um, what's also fascinating, and I think you and I discussed this at some point, I think in the evening at dinner, is the idea that you have Rob Adamson, who was a chief pharmacist, and I think that the reality is that what he was doing as a pharmacist allowed him to engage with many different groups across the organization, and that
Mhm.
actually well suited him to now to move into that CIO leadership role, because of the relationships he'd built with many people across the organization. And I think you hit on this earlier, is I think the reason he's so successful is he's able to you know how do we say this, figuratively or literally, like, cross the aisle in many different ways to
Mhm.
build partnerships across the organization to drive the change he's looking for. And I think that's actually something that I think often gets underestimated for a lot of people that are trying to drive some version of change across any organization around transformation, is that type of individual who can speak many different languages. And I say languages meaning, maybe today we're talking tech, but tomorrow we're talking more clinical workflow, and then we're talking financial workflow. And I think as we see leaders kind of straddle all of that, and maybe it's compliance and security, like as they kind of straddle all of that, they're able to drive change because they can communicate. And it's not like this isn't some novel idea, but I think it's the reality, is like that's what drives change in many organizations. And we can't forget that as we talk about driving change around AI, because it's challenging, and it creates an organizational shift, and some of that requires these type of leaders to be in that place.
And
um
to me,
Go ahead.
that's what was encouraging about the summit is I think we saw, a density of that type of leader.
Hmm.
And like I said earlier, we've been talking about this for decades, but it is here we have those types of leaders. That's the good news. Um, and again, impressive of how they were able to describe the leadership that they've been providing in their healthcare system, share that with others, and help spread that.
Yeah. The next session I want to talk about is so we did a panel, and the thought process around this was the executive tightrope we're seeing with AI transformation. And the whole thought process around this panel was, I think, to me, a lot of IT executives are still trying to navigate yesterday's problems. And so
Mhm.
yesterday's problems are the cost pressures we see, the security threat around ransomware and biomedical devices, and more importantly, just the technical debt that always seems to burden healthcare. For I don't care who you are, it burdens many healthcare systems. And so my thought process was, if we're going to drive innovation and change these organizations, like, we still have to figure out how we're going to solve yesterday's problems. And
Correct.
so in that panel, we had Laura Baggis, the CTO of Vanderbilt's University Medical Center. We had Shabu Thomas, the CTO of the Cleveland Clinic, as well as Nick O'Connor, the CTO of Trinity Health. And what I found that panel unique was, you have some high powered executives across three different health systems, but the challenges seem to be the same. Like they're all trying to drive some version of change and innovation, but they're
Mhm.
still trying to deal with the realities of what we were dealing
Right.
with yesterday. What's your feedback there, Matt?
I pause there for a minute, just taking in the magnitude of technical debt that we have
Yeah.
in all industries, but perhaps even more so in healthcare. Um, based a lot of it around mergers and acquisitions,
Hmm.
growth of health systems, et cetera. There's just a lot of technical debt there. Um, Again, and I realize I keep talking about this as a theme, but the acceleration of technology opportunity and challenge that's coming, I think we're really, and we heard this from those CTOs, the need to be much more agile in how we think about things like enterprise architecture,
Hmm.
fact that infrastructure needs to be refreshed more often than every 5 to 10 years. I mean, you and I both know this, having worked in data center oriented
Yep.
spaces for many years. You could often rely, 10, 20 years on an architecture in a data center, refresh during that time. Now you might have every 2 to 3 years. And so that's really putting, a whole new perspective and expectation on CTOs of how they can have an infrastructure that's flexible and adaptable. AI is only going to continue the pressure to do that, and we're going to need to see healthcare CTOs really rethink how they approach infrastructure planning and enterprise architecture.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed. Yeah, I think that, the one thing that hits home is like I don't think there's a silver bullet for any of these issues. And
Mhm.
I think to your point, even what we talk around, so, the vulnerability management around what we're going to hear come down the line with Mythos, and then more importantly, just the susceptibility around biomedical devices and some of these vendors. Don't roll patches or updates or even exist anymore, right? And so I think that's always the challenge I see is okay, well, how do we mitigate those vulnerabilities and those attacks? At the same time, I think I just see technical debt as such an inhibitor for a lot of the challenges we see, right? So why do we have POC purgatory or pilot purgatory? It's
Right.
because in this sandbox it worked perfectly, but guess what? In the real production, we have technical debt. We have silos of data. We have systems that are antiquated. There's no consistent systems at many times when we're dealing with M&A, and that causes a lot of burden on not only the IT organization but the system itself,
Correct.
which then leads outsiders to think like why are they not moving fast enough, and it's because of that. And so yeah, I think like, going back to that session, just the three leaders that we had at the table, I think they all brought unique perspective around how they're trying to solve for it, which is great. It's good to see that, like, we're not just gonna roll over. We need to solve for it, and we need to figure out ways to just think differently and not think the
Right.
traditional waterfall. Let's go refresh existing life cycles. Like, let's be methodical and just reimagine the way we support these types of initiatives.
Well, there was the other dimension of the conversation in that panel, beyond infrastructure, which was around AI adoption. And, I'm wondering, you know, how did it strike you, the conversation around the fact that they did not feel that vibe coding was going to be productive at scale within a healthcare enterprise,
Sure.
still knowing it's going to be going on, et cetera. And we talked a bit, about whether or not software development may accelerate within healthcare organizations due to AI, et cetera. I'm just wondering, what was your take on that, and what are your
Yeah.
thoughts on that dimension of the conversation?
Yeah, that's a good thought process. I think that came up in many different discussions, so it wasn't just that panel. Like I think throughout the day we talked a little bit around vibe coding in general, and that, if you stopped me maybe a few months ago, I'd be like, hey, like, yeah, I think in the next 24 months we're going to see a lot of internal development within health systems because these resources are just more accessible, right? And I said when I say that we're talking software developers who, we can go recruit off the street now because there's talent available in the marketplace. And you take those developers, now you enable them with tools like Cloud Code that allow them to build and stitch solution, like even just UIs now that was traditionally the kind of development we'd see. Yes, I think that's going to happen in pockets. I think a lot of that leadership in that group was like, hey, like we're experiencing it and we're talking about it, which I think that's the first natural change. Anytime
Mhm.
there's enterprise software that they're comparing it to, the fact that they're even like, one CIO was like, the fact that we even brought it up and said, could we build it ourselves, is a
Mhm.
progressive change from 18 months ago. So let's acknowledge that, and that, like, we have to acknowledge that the fact that it's being debated and articulated means that's progress. Could it
Mhm.
change in 6 months because we're seeing increases with model development? Yeah, that absolutely can happen as well. I also think, and this is something that didn't come up in the summit, but I was talking to several peers, and actually, I think even at some point, like Sarah Hatchett, like I think the idea is, I think a lot of times when people think around agentic development, they think, hey, well, we're going to go build an agent to go toggle a UI. Well, the reality is, like, that's probably not the type of agent that we're going to see in the next few years. The reality is
Correct.
that it's going to be an agent that interacts with a system of record on the back end,
Mhm.
and then interfaces with the human on the front end. And that is the UI. And so to me, I think that can dramatically change. Not just healthcare, is going to change every industry pretty quickly, and isn't the big inhibitor that we think it is. And so I think a lot of people think of, okay, well, like if I roll out this production vibe coded application, it doesn't have the type of testing, and maybe even if this is regulated, we're not going to see what we see with some of the standard application sets we see in hospitals. I think that changes a little bit when we start to go like real natural native agentic workflows, and some of that may evolve. And I think that we're just not there yet. We're not there yet, if that makes sense.
No, I agree with your observations there. And one thing that struck me in the conversations, outside the panel, and over dinner, et cetera, was the fact that a lot of us are still assuming when we talk about agentic AI that a lot of it is either done by massive software development shops or it's vibe coding. Um, I I think we simply need to educate ourselves more. That, for instance, specification driven development, which is a thing, understand what it is and
Mhm.
understand that that's the type of development that's going to be adopted in regulated industries like healthcare, et cetera, and that it isn't simply spitting out a couple paragraphs to Claude code and saying here go write this, but that there's actually a way to manage it
Mhm.
that is traceable, and does put guardrails around it. And so I think some of it just is being able to get past the popular press and vibe coding is what everybody wants to talk about. The reality is there's a lot more to it than that,
Sure.
and there's a lot that we need to learn.
Yeah. Yeah. I think collectively, like, it's still early days, and I think a lot of people are still exploring it. But I think if we really put our hats on, I think it's going to change in the next 2 to 3 years, and we would be prepared for that. Um, I want to jump into our sponsor session, right? So a lot of we do an event like this, it's not possible without our sponsors, helping and contributing to the event. And so, the Healthcare 2026, Healthcare Summit 2026 was sponsored by Dell and Nvidia. And so
Mhm.
we were joined by, Ryan Shula from Dell, as well as Aaron Anderson from Nvidia. What was your kind of thought process around what they're seeing in the healthcare market in regards to how their technologies drive a lot of the change we've been discussing?
As you'd expect, the early progress with AI in healthcare tends to be within research, so often academic medical centers, biotech,
Hmm.
pharma, etc. And there's definitely wins there, but I think also we heard from them there's starting to be valid use cases within the provider space that may not be simply research oriented. And the impressive thing was they were able to focus on use cases and outcomes, not simply the technology. And so I think that just helped reinforce this general sense that we've been discussing, which is AI is here, and we need to deal with it, whether we like it or not. And I say that about, I'm not a full throated advocate of AI. I think it needs to have guardrails. We need to be thoughtful about it, etc. But it's very clear that it's here. I'm interested. What did you take away from that panel?
I think a couple things. One I think they always often see a lens that we don't see in regards to I think the broader spectrum around healthcare, right? So like, to your point, like around, some of the innovation happening around wearables, I think even robotics. And we do a lot of we do a lot of custom integration through our foundry facility that aligns to some of the medical device manufacturing. But I think what they see is more just the increase in demand we're seeing, especially in the medtech space as well as the biotech
Mhm.
space. And I think to me, that's going to drive, at the end of the day, that drives the innovation that eventually gets brought into the client base that we're discussing.
Right.
And so it's fascinating to kind of hear kind of their perspective of, we're seeing this fervor, I'd say this acceleration in the med tech and biotech. You could probably even throw robotics into that space.
Mhm.
And say, okay, well, like if this is where if this is where these organizations are going and they're bringing this technology to our provider counterparts, I think we can expect that type of innovation pretty soon. And so I think I always appreciate that perspective because I think it gives us a bigger lens, right, into what eventually is going to be consumed by our provider clients.
Mhm.
Um, so that being said, Matt, I think the last session, which I think was the crowd favorite, right, and it was
Mhm.
just more along the lines of just the hospitality provided to us by the Cleveland Clinic was the exclusive tour of their IBM Quantum System One, which is a rarity even in the sense that we have a quantum computer that sits within on premise at the Cleveland Clinic.
Mhm.
What was your take on that? I know we took some really good photos. I think that the tour was exceptional in regards to some of the facts. What was your biggest takeaway that kind of stood out to you?
Well, I mean, first of all, it was just very cool to be able to see a quantum computer.
Hmm.
It's not something that is an everyday occurrence. I sent a picture to my 20-year-old daughter, and her immediate response was that it was sick. Not the language I would use, but that was her comment. And then said, I want to intern there. Obviously, it's impressive in many ways, which is great.
Yeah,
Um, the thing that I took away from that discussion was really how Cleveland Clinic is leveraging their HPC environment
yeah,
to do simulated quantum because of cost, et cetera. And I say that not just that narrowly, but the whole chain that you can use more traditional compute storage for some things that then feed up to the HPC. You can offload from quantum to HPC, prove something in HPC, and then take it to quantum. Um, it just really hit me in a way it hadn't before, how we need to think about this much more systemically, and that quantum isn't some island onto itself, but really is part of the broader IT ecosystem that we've been building, and that responsible use of it is having part of it as that broader system.
yeah. I think to me it's fascinating that in the way, to your point, like to see a quantum computer up close, especially in that the way they kind of display it, and the chandelier, the way it hangs in within that glass enclosure. And so for those watching the video, we'll bring a picture up so you guys can see it. I think to me was
Running at 0 Kelvin, right? Of nearly 400 and some negative degrees Fahrenheit.
Yes, yes. So not only the cooling infrastructure within that glass enclosure, and I think that tour guy said it's the same type of glass that we see that surrounds the Mona Lisa. Not only
Correct.
protection from UV, but also just the thickness. It's fascinating. Obviously it's intricate, but also to your point right around the HPC is we're seeing a trend, especially with a lot of our research-driven organizations, and some of those were represented in that room, where they're making investments in HPC, and some of that
Mhm.
is driven around, okay, how do we modernize HPC environments to support a lot of the GPU, machine learning, and AI capabilities that researchers are asking for now? Also, just shows us that this is all integrated into the innovation pipeline that we're talking about,
Mhm.
and I think each health system consumes it differently, but at the same time, like these are the same challenges, and so when I think of large HPC GPU environments, so that those require special cooling and facility needs that I
Mhm.
think now health systems are taking on that burden, right? And so they have to think about that as they kind of move forward. So that all in all to say is, I think all these discussions are fascinating, right? There's no silver bullet for any of the challenges that we talked through, but it's interesting to see that you drive a lot of commonality and collaboration when a lot of organizations can come together and say, here's what we're working on, and by the way, here's some novel ideas of how we think we solved for it. To me, I think that's always rewarding when you get notes from clients who say, hey, like, this is very thoughtful discussion, very timely discussion, and more importantly, I think also just drives the thought leadership that I think many organizations are looking for, as they're looking for people to partner with. And so, Matt, that being said, I'll leave you with some final notes. Like, anything else that you want to share for our client base that's kind of top of mind that we didn't cover yet.
I think just, to recap what we've talked about, is the 25 healthcare leaders we had with us made it very evident that there's strong, capable healthcare IT leadership, and that we need to recognize that so we know how to both grow and identify more leadership like that, given the challenges that are coming, and what our patients deserve. And at the end of the day, I think that's heartening to know that there is strong leadership. There are models. We just need to challenge ourselves to find more of it.
That's great. Well, Matt, I think that leads us to our recap of the Healthcare Summit 2026. I think for our listeners, what we would say is if you're interested in attending the 2027 Summit, reach out to your head counterparts. We'll make sure that it's on your radar. It's obviously a popular event now that we want to continue to foster and grow. And we're always looking for contributions on the speaker side, as well as people looking to join us next year. So that being said, Matt, thanks for the time and thanks for your knowledge and inspiration.
Same for you.